Yeah, we're going to talk about a very strong topic today, and it doesn't matter if you're female or male, although if you are a male, it might actually impact you. Today's episode is the ego bruising during an apology. So you're going to want to listen up to this because a lot of couples, they like to argue and they like to fight. And there's something to be said about the ego and apology. It's almost like the ego has to die for some people in order to actually apologize to somebody else. And when people refuse to apologize, that's their way of preserving their ego in some way, shape, or form. So it does show that inability to be mature, and that does show the inability to work something out with people. Let's go over it. Because when a person's ego gets bruised during an apology, more often than not, they are viewing accountability as a loss. And they're viewing that accountability as a loss of status rather than trying to make things right and repair the relationship. That's where it gets really wild. So when a relationship is healthy and the dynamic is very healthy, then saying sorry when you actually did something is quite functional. And it's going to support the relationship. Because, okay, the relationship's having trouble. Communication's going to bring you further away or closer. It's a bridge. And you're either going to bridge it or not. An apology is part of that communication. But then it has to yield something else. It has to give accountability. Accountability is what you speak to. So, for example, when we look at responsibility is the duty you have, the work that you do, but accountability is how you speak to it. But if a person is very ego-driven, if they live according to their ego, and we're talking the unhealthy ego, the out-of-control ego, the control freak ego, for that individual, an apology feels like a major problem and feels like some sort of admission of guilt or an admission of defectiveness. And they feel that they are surrendering their power of any kind. And it's not benefiting the relationship. It's not reaching any higher ground with your partner. We have to look at why it's actually happening, because what it actually does is totally cause damage to the process of genuine accountability. And this happens to be masculine accountability as well as feminine. Absolutely. I'm going to speak to the masculine side only right now, just a little bit, but accountability is how you speak to it. And yes, the ego getting bruised can be a problem. And the fact is certain people, when they have an ego, they want to be brash, but they don't want to be bruised. So they want to be brash to other people. They want to be rude to other people, but when someone's rude to them, it's like, oh, sorry, can't do that. Their ego gets bruised as a result. And that happens from time to time. But when we look at an apology for these people, when they have their ego so strong, the apology, it seems like vulnerability or weakness to them. And they're used to the competition. They're used to the fight. They're used to having to win. And maybe they're used to that in their social groups and their hierarchies that are there. So an apology is viewed weak. It's viewed as a strategic disadvantage, sometimes even cultural in some places, that if you are a man and you apologize, that there's an issue. Okay? You can't do that. God forbid you're wrong, right? So it totally knocks the scale and tips the scale of balance, and it tips the power. And you know what it does is it causes a lot of damage and can completely compromise their own standing in the relationship. Because when your partner wakes up and actually realizes that you have the inability to say sorry, then you can't even move forward. And that's the first part about it, is that you have to be able to say sorry, but sorry also demands change afterward. And you can say sorry till you're blue in the face. But you know what? You can say sorry, but that doesn't mean you can change. And for all the ladies that are listening, I want to say that to you, is that just because they say sorry doesn't mean they can actually change. They can say sorry over and over and over again. So yeah, we have to be able to look at it. We have to look at this dynamic and this scale of power that's actually tilting back and forth. We have to look at it from a behavioral standpoint, because an apology can totally alter the balance in their eyes between the parties that seem to be competing. But it's not really a competition. One side is competing. The other one isn't. The other one wants to negotiate and try to get closer and solve the problem, and the other one wants to compete. There has to be a winner in their eyes. And you know what's interesting about that is we see that in business, and we see that in executive business, that there's stakes involved and there's negotiation and there's a competition involved and there's this power dynamic that goes on. But when you start to put that in your relationship and then you realize that you're actually damaging your own relationship, but you don't have enough self-awareness to realize that you're carrying this executive ability into your marriage, into your relationship, and actually causing damage because you're not self-aware to realize. So offering an apology can somehow send the message that you're yielding or you're giving up or you're giving in, and you feel that it's going to get exploited from the other party. So that becomes a perceived vulnerability. And you feel that there has to be a greater concession now, that you have to give in even more. And that bothers you. That bothers the ego. Doesn't matter if you're man, doesn't matter if you're woman. But the bigger the ego, the harder it is. Now, when we get down to it, when we look at behavior and we look at the research of behavior, we can see when an individual or a person apologizes. And sometimes that apology decreases the perception of the other person. That's what it looks like. So if there's an admission of a mistake, that's interpreted as a sign of capability or a lack of capability. That's how it's perceived. So we see that a lot in the leadership circles, which I know a thing or two about. And they see it as weakness at the end of the day. But here's the deal. Let's look at the other perspective. People won't apologize because they also feel that it's admitting wrongdoing. The moment you apologize, you admit that you're wrong. And from a psychological point of view, and even language-based, that apology in the relationship, it serves as an acknowledgement that you broke a rule, or you crossed a boundary, or you had an error in actual judgment. But when we look at all this, when we look at conflict resolution and how we deal with conflict, right, and we look at the studies behind behavior, they show that a complete apology often has to make clear the specific behavior that was done and the negative impact. And that can bruise people's egos right there. And if they don't admit what happened, if they don't have a strong admission that a standard was broken, a standard that was violated by that individual, then somehow it will not be understood or register as a genuine apology to the receiving party. And what it does is it starts to look like an excuse that gets minimized and shrunk down. So let's look at it all, shall we? Let's look at the internal versus external, the internal worth versus the external worth. So a bruised ego during an apology, what it shows us is that the person's self-worth is entirely fragile, absolutely fragile. And it's based on their performance and how they're performing in front of other people. So they can't separate their behavior from their identity. And as you know, I'm the person who does identity reconstruction. Interesting, isn't it, right? But to the secure person in this whole picture, saying I made a mistake simply means that I did something and it had a bad result. But to someone who's absolutely insecure, or to an insecure, ego-dominating person, saying I made a mistake is internalized as I'm not perfect and I'm a bad person. And guess what? Their little psychology and psyche can't handle that, can't handle the heaviness of that feeling because they feel fundamentally flawed. And what happens is their ego reacts. They react emotionally. They throw things. They get irritated. They get defensive. Or even worse, they finger point back. And that's where the defensiveness comes out, or even the resentment. And they even say, you made me feel this way. They finger point back to you because they have to rotate the tables because they've just lost the power imbalance. So the apology is absolutely agonizing. It is they look at it like it's an agonizing extraction rather than opening up their heart and voluntarily offering an apology. So, what are some of the signs of seeing the ego bruised apology? When they feel forced to apologize, but their ego is resisting accountability and they have to finger point back, and the apology will almost always be defensive and twisted. I'm sorry, but you'll get the but in there as well. So you'll typically see the behavioral messages that come across. Like, what is the sign behaviorally that comes across? Well, they might offer what's called a conditional apology. I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt, but, and there's a trail on to there. So now when that happens, they throw their blame out there in some way, shape, or form. I'm sorry, but if you didn't say X, I would have never said it. There's some kind of justification. They use the word but, and they use that to minimize their own responsibility. They use that to minimize their accountability as well. Because what they have to do is they have to point out the circumstances outside of them rather than take up the accountability, rather than doing something about it. So in some situations, and it does happen, they will adopt a victim mindset. And it'll be so obvious and so miserable and dramatic even. It becomes so dramatic about having to apologize that you end up comforting them and they don't even realize, they don't have enough self-awareness to realize what their own behavior is like. So what happens is they reverse the emotional obligation onto you. That's what happens with the whole emotional obligation. Interesting, isn't it? So when we look at true accountability, and I'm going to use this phrase because it's used in the spiritual circles, but guess what? It's going to be used today. True accountability requires the ego death, requires the ego to die. And they don't like that. It hurts. It hurts the ego to apologize. And true accountability cannot be there right alongside the preservation of that person's ego. So to fully account for the damage that's been done to another person, you have to literally set aside your need to be right, your need to be perceived as perfect, and your quote-unquote desire to protect your reputation and your ego. An authentic apology, along with the change that has to occur after and the work that has to be done, an authentic apology requires a moment of conflict, and it'll be voluntary conflict because you're working something out, where you accept that uncomfortable part of being the cause of someone else's pain. And if someone, by chance, is deeply resentful while they're saying actual sorry, they are grieving that little tiny loss of their pristine, blown out self-image more than they are grieving the hurt that they actually caused you. And they are focusing wholeheartedly on their own bruised ego instead of the damage and the wound that they've caused to you and what they have inflicted. So it gets interesting because this dynamic, it shows up as a very stubborn to refuse the admission of their own personal faults. And it shows up in perfectionists, and it shows up in narcissists, and it shows up in hyper-competitive people. And that's where it gets interesting, because it all comes out to some defensive counterattack and pointing blame back on the other person when the issue was actually raised. And that's all I'm going to say on today's episode. That was an episode that needs to be well understood by a lot of people. Take it from me, former court Massachusetts mediator. Have a great day. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and do me a favor. Share this with anyone. It doesn't matter if you're male or female, but yes, we have seen that little masculine ego get bruised really bad. But it also happens for the ladies just as well. It just happens in different contexts, different ways, different situations. You can't template match scenarios. Have a great day. Like and subscribe. Take care.